Okay, well, I gotta say, a little bit nervous. I counted more than 3 people with Ph.D. next to their names, and that makes me nervous. One of them is my wife. Makes me more nervous, but I always feel like someone's gonna fix my grammar or like, but I count on your support, okay? Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Mr. Jeff Parker is here with us. So, when you exit the room today, please do me a favor, go to Jeff Parker and shake his hands and say thank you for me, okay? Don't ask me why, just do it. Good evening, everyone, and welcome again. Thank you for joining us for another exceptional evening, a time when members of our community come together around a shared commitment for Eugene Parks, trails, and open spaces. These gatherings are a chance to connect, to reflect, and to celebrate the impact we're making together. Over a good conversation, some refreshments, a little bit of alcohol, and our shared love of the outdoors. For those who don't know us, don't know me, my name is Ariel Lisman, Executive Director of Eugene Parks Foundation, and at the Eugene Parks Foundation, our vision is a thriving, accessible parks and recreation system that improves community health and wealth, enhances our environment, and supports social and economic well-being. We pursue this vision through strong public-private partnerships with our partners at Parks and Open Space, Eugene Rec, the U of O, the health industry, and different nonprofits in town, all that to protect land, expand trail networks, add meaningful amenities and programs to our parks that make our parks more welcoming and usable for all. We also believe parks must be active, and so we invest in free park programs. We work to remove barriers from underserved families and encourage year-round connection to nature by working with health providers who, as we speak, already piloting a prescribing nature initiative to at-risk youth, 240 of them in our community. At the heart of all this work is a growing network of partners. Some of them are here today, and supporters, people like you who make this possible. So, first of all, round of applause to you guys who are here tonight. I'm also proud to share that tonight marks the 3rd year of our Parks Talk series. This tradition has grown thanks to the leadership, care, and vision of our board member, Sir Kenny Helfand. Kenny, where are you? Kenny has guided this program with thoughtful stewardship from the very beginning. Now let me share some few updates that reflect what private-public partnership makes possible. We recently helped secure and stabilize the Forest Ranch property, a beautiful and ecologically significant 73-acre of woodland near Lorraine Highway. This area offers rare, intact natural habitat just minutes from Eugene through a $1.2 million investment. The foundation purchased and protected the land before transferring it to the city's Parks and Open Space team for long-term stewardship. Applause now. Another recent milestone is the upcoming expansion of 2.5 miles of trails in South Eugene Meadows Park. This project will connect the park to Spencer Butte and include a new parking area to improve access. It's a great example of how collaboration between foundation and the city, each pushing the other to go further, resulted in a fully funded project that benefits the entire community. So bids are out, and hopefully this summer we're going to celebrate. Your cue. Looking ahead, we're excited to explore a potential new project we are calling Antis-Oaks, just west of Wild Iris Ridge. It's still in early stages, but we hope to share more soon. And while we continue protecting land, we're equally focused on activating the parks that we already have. One example is the upcoming launch of Agents of Discovery, a mobile platform designed to engage children and families through outdoor missions and learning experiences across our park system. So I'd like to introduce you to Ms. Cordelia Rios, who will be our parks presenter, and I will actually let her do the talking.
Welcome, explorers. I'm Ms. Cordelia Rios, Blue Heron, Ridge Walker, River Watcher, and your guide for the Eugene Parks Foundation's Agents of Discovery adventure. Whether you're a local or just visiting, I'm thrilled to welcome you on a journey through Eugene's parks, trails, rivers, and wetlands. You're invited to complete 6 fun missions with 60 interactive challenges. We'll explore ridges with views, rivers full of life, wetlands rich with wonder, and parks full of everyday magic. Each mission reveals a story about Eugene's nature, history, and community. So let's stretch our wings and explore. Your adventure starts now with downloading the Agents of Discovery app.
How about that? All right. Yeah. So as we speak, we are building the content for our first missions. It's going to be around the Delta Ponds, Ridgeline, 2 neighborhood parks in Bethel and Santa Clara, Willamette River, Alton Baker, and West Eugene wetlands. So it's going to take us a few more weeks, but once you download the Agents of Discovery app, you'll see 6 missions in Eugene. Go out with your kids, with your families, with your friends, with visitors, and just enjoy the outdoors while we're experiencing tech and outdoors together. So our ability to act quickly, test new ideas, and invest strategically comes from the strength of our partnerships, especially with the City of Eugene, and the generosity of our supporters. This flexibility allows us to remove barriers, respond to emerging needs, and scale what works, and eliminate what doesn't. It's made possible by our committed board of directors that are here today, and a group of more than 60 Legacy Circle members whose support is helping us shape the future of Eugene Park System. And if you feel inspired, I know you are, to be a part of that legacy, call us, let's talk, let's connect later. This evening, we're turning our attention to an issue that touches all of us, wildfire preparedness and resilience. As we began organizing tonight's conversation, something remarkable happened. For me, people from across sectors, public safety, forestry, parks, education, stepped forward with offers to share tools, insight, protocols, information, and was a powerful reminder of what's possible when community comes together, not just to respond, but to prepare, to plan, and support one another. I'm truly honored to welcome all of you community partners that are here tonight, and deeply grateful for our community we're building together. Now, before I hand things over to our next speaker, I'd like to note that our next Parks talk is coming soon in the fall by the one and only, again, Mr. Kenneth Helfand, and it's going to be about Visionary Oregon, a look at visions accomplished and imagined. So I already know what's in the slides. I dare you not to come. That said, please welcome Kenny Helfand.
I'm not the speaker tonight. Next time. Can we have a round of applause for Ariel? He is... I've been on other organizations and departments, etc. I know no one who approaches their job with the same energy and, in fact, vision than Ariel. It's extraordinary. Okay. So we're here tonight to learn about fire and about how to respond to fires in the area that we live in our places. Everyone here has either direct or indirect experience with the Holiday Farm fire that devastated the Mackenzie River Valley and destroyed the town of Blue River, where many of us know folks, who lost their homes. And more recently, I think we all watched live on television the progress of fires in Los Angeles, again, where many of us know family or friends who suffered or live in the path of those fires. And we looked around us, in fact, our own community, we know we live in a forest, largely, and with homes, in fact, largely made of wood. Our speaker today is my colleague from the Department of Landscape Architecture at the U of O, Bart Johnson. So let me tell you a little bit about Bart, just a little bit, because he sent me his resume. And, I just kept going pages and pages. No, I just looked at the first part. Okay. Bart, in fact, has degrees, first in agronomy, then a master's in landscape architecture, and also then a Ph.D. in landscape ecology. But those are just credentials. Bart is, in fact, a renowned scholar who studied everything from soils to habitat restoration, and like a good ecologist, has addressed environmental issues at all scales, from microbial environments to climate change. But he's also, in fact, a wilderness first responder, an inveterate traveler in places from the North Arctic to prairies to tropical rainforests, and he has studied permaculture, agriculture, farming methods in Japan and China, where he also went on to teach in China, and he also, in fact, plays the drums and plays something called the handpan. How many of you know what a handpan is? A few of you, okay? I just was given a demonstration recently. He can tell you what it is. It's amazing. But I want to address Bart as an educator, since he is here to educate us today about fire. For 30 years, he has taught in our department applied landscape ecology to our students. Well, what does that mean? Bart describes it as how he has taught how to design and planning issues address the integration of ecological function and ecosystem services in the urban landscape. That's his description. He teaches, I hit something, sorry. Okay. He teaches how ecological understanding can be fundamental as a basis for design and planning. Landscape ecology is, in fact, a new science. And as a scientist, in fact, when Bart joined the U of O, he had to convince the administration that as a science in our design school, he was entitled to a laboratory. And eventually, he did get one. It took a lot of effort, in fact. Our graduates, in fact, come out of our department with a working knowledge of landscape ecology, how to apply that knowledge, and most importantly, they learn to ask the right questions, okay? And if they don't know the answer, about where and when to look for the answers. Inevitably, that leads to collaboration, a way of working that Bart, in fact, models and has been essential to all his endeavors. The tables outside here are a testament to that collaboration. Okay. Bart also communicates an infectious understanding of how the world operates, from fungi underneath the soil to the atmosphere. He knows that people learn in many ways. So as a scientist, he teaches his students how to read scientific papers. Field experience is essential for landscape architects. So Bart takes his classes on week-long studies in the Siskiyous wilderness. But my favorite project that he's done is where students choose a species to study and share everything they've learned about that species, okay? Everything they've learned, its life cycle, its habitat, what it eats and who eats it, how it moves, and more. And for the final presentation, the class comes dressed up as that animal. And Lawrence Hall, our building, looks like Halloween, but without ghosts or princesses. Okay. Tonight, Bart isn't dressed up, okay? No one dresses up in Eugene. Tonight, he is here to talk about fire. So imagine that we're all safely sitting around a campfire where we get to listen and learn. Please join me in welcoming my friend and colleague, Bart Johnson.
Okay, we're ready to go. Well, thank you, Ariel and Kenny, and I hope that was recorded. I want to listen to that again sometime and see if it really was me. I'm really delighted to see you all here, in particular our colleagues from the different wildfire and prescribed fire and habitat restoration agencies who came here to share with you today. They were here before, they'll be here after the talk as well if you want to ask them more questions. So I wrestled with the title before settling on the simplicity of preparing for wildfire. But as I worked the ideas, it was clear that what held them together was building community, something we in the state of Oregon, here in the city of Eugene, have long taken to heart. As we look toward a future with strong evidence of increasingly severe wildfires, we have the opportunity to use this strength to shape our future before fire shapes it for us. Within this framing, I have two objectives. I want to offer practical guidance for actions in our everyday lives. I also want to build a foundation for understanding how fire interacts with landscapes, and through this, explore how we as a community can influence when, where, and how we encounter fire. Different kinds of fire have different consequences. Not surprisingly, we'd rather have fire serve our needs and protect our interests than threaten them. It's been said that in the U.S. West, the question is not whether any given location will burn, but when. With that in mind, how do we prepare to meet fire? Most of the actions I'll present are already being implemented by local agencies and organizations. I hope to weave them together into a practical framework for how we can build our core values into a fire-resilient civic landscape for ourselves and future generations. Along those lines, note that this image doesn't show wildfire. It's prescribed fire here in the Willamette Valley. Cultural fire being set intentionally to do its good work for ecosystems. And as part of that, protect our homes and our properties. Many organizations and individuals are working to seam together both sides of that equation, ecological good and cultural good. We call that formal and informal network of agencies and organizations working together a fire management network. It includes emergency response teams who activate during a fire event, risk mitigation specialists who work to reduce risk before a fire, and on-the-ground practitioners who use cultural fire for the multiple benefits and services it provides. Tonight, I'll focus on risk mitigation and propose to you that most centrally, the network is about collaboration and cooperation, and that it includes all of us. We need these folks to coordinate actions across large multi-ownership landscapes, and they need us to implement actions at our own lands and to support their broader initiatives. Representatives from many of the organizations shown are here tonight. You had a chance to meet with them before, and you'll have another chance afterward. The reason collaboration is needed is that fire doesn't just occur here or there. Fire ignites in a location and spreads across the landscape. Along the way, it encounters fuels that resist burning or augment it, that slow it down or speed it up. What you do on your property affects your neighbors, and what your neighbors do, sometimes even distant ones, can affect you for better or worse. I can make that point in the abstract, or I can make it in a more personal way with a simulation model our research team created that projects possible futures in and around Eugene, including some futures we'd rather live in than others. I'm going to return to this simulated fire later. I think right now it's about ready to burn Spencer Butte. The first three parts of this talk, the 2020 wake-up call, understanding wildfire and risk from past to present to future, set the stage for the last section, which seams them together by applying the three themes of think like wildfire, think about more than wildfire, and act at three scales to practical proposals for action. How many of you were here during the 2020 holiday farm fires? Yeah. How many knew someone who was evacuated, who lost their home? How many were essentially trapped in their home from the smoke? Yeah. This image shows the fires that consumed the greatest number of homes in Oregon in 2020. A set of enormous simultaneous wildfires that blanketed the U.S. West with smoke. I wasn't personally threatened, but like many of you, we were pinned in our house for nearly 9 days, with windows taped shut, air filters running to reduce smoke levels that were literally off the charts. We were among the lucky ones. Close to 1 million acres burned in Oregon and over 6,000 structures, most of them homes. Large wildfires like this are not new in the Willamette Valley, but what is new is the increased aridity, the longer fire season, and a potentially greater overlap of the dry season with the months when the hot east winds, called Finn winds here, Santa Ana winds in California, are likely. I want you to note that the smallest fire on the map burned the most homes. The fires were preceded by an extremely dry summer with little to no rain as we headed into September. Large logs on the forest floor were dry as kiln-dried lumber, and living vegetation had extremely low fuel moistures, making it easy to ignite and sustain a fire. There was an ignition at the time of hot, dry winds that came down the valley like a blowtorch. I led a team of students to work with homeowners along the Mackenzie River on Good Pasture Lane. This is one account of the night of the fire. Things happened fast. They lost everything they didn't take with them. One of the most shocking to them was trying to get from the house to their car and gagging on swarms of insects being driven in front of the fire. Nothing prepared them for this. Another couple told me that when they finally got back to their home, they thought, well, at least we're going to be able to pick up grandmother's cast iron skillets. They'd melted. The first idea we brought to the table with them was that the future will not be like the past. As individuals and cultures, we learn mostly by trial and error. Over time, we accumulate lessons that indicate if we do this, this is the likely outcome. But what do we do when the lessons of the past are grossly inadequate for the future? How do we contemplate a future with deep climate and wildfire uncertainty that's unlike anything in our experience? It was easy for residents on Good Pasture Lane to think that what they needed to do was recreate what they'd had, a beautiful, shady Douglas fir forest. Our job was to help them look forward toward a landscape that could safely transmit and receive fire over the long term. That's the goal of the 2050 image there. The various projections for the Willamette Valley agree that our winters will continue to be cool and wet, which means they'll support abundant fuels. But while summers are expected to be warmer, there are conflicting projections for the length of the rainy season, which could dramatically increase or decrease the length and intensity of the fire season. If you travel to parts of California known as wildfire hotspots, you'll notice there's less fuels, less stuff to burn than here. But if Willamette Valley summers become more like the extended hot, dry droughts of California and our fuels become readily burnable, it'll be a very different world here, and events like the 2020 wildfires may not be a one-off. In the face of such deep uncertainty, our research team has hung its hat on the idea that we can't hope to predict the future of wildfire, but that we can explore and test large numbers of simulated alternative futures to try and identify approaches to land management development that perform well across a broad range of possibilities over the next 50 years. We want to anticipate surprise and act now to reduce future harm. Back in 2013, we simulated future land management, urban-rural development, and wildfire under different climate projections in a rural study area outside of the Eugene-Springfield area. These maps show 50-year fire footprints under two contrasting climate models. The Muroc model on the left projected little change in wildfire until the 2050s, while the Hadley model on the right projected increased wildfires as early as 2017 that could be as large as 40,000 acres, 150 square miles. No management strategy we tested could stop wildfire losses, but they could be cut in half. That's pretty significant. We expected reviewers to balk at the Hadley wildfire outcomes. They were unprecedented in recent history. Then the Holiday Farm Fire almost reached our study area, 4 times bigger than the largest fire we'd simulated, and that map is accurate in the location and the size of the fire. If those winds had persisted for another 1 to 2 days, the fire likely would have gotten into Thurston Hills and into Springfield, and it would have been a whole different matter. So now, before I leave, look at this middle image. It's also the Muroc model of little wildfire change, but in 1 of 50 futures, there was a fire that burned 20 square miles in 2052 and threatened 900 homes, and it happened under the most successful fuels management strategy we tested. So the question posed is, how do we reduce the likelihood of extreme but rare events that may never happen without giving up other things we care about and want from our landscapes? So let's examine some basics of wildfire and risk. To understand risk, we need to carefully distinguish two key terms in the natural disaster literature that are often misunderstood: hazard and risk. So imagine the black lines show two rooms with a wall between them. Which room would you rather be in? The tigers are the same. Well, I'm guessing you probably want to be in the room that's furthest away from you there. And the point is that the hazard is identical. The tigers are the same. The risk is dramatically different. You have just learned the critical difference between hazard and risk. I want you to remember it. Risk is an expectation of value change. It's likelihood and change in value, and risk is used to deal with uncertainty. To understand wildfire behavior and effects, let's start with the ingredients of a fire, shown in the box. To get those ingredients to burn and sustain a fire, you need three things to come together: oxygen, heat, and fuel, called the fire triangle. Remove any one of those and fire will not burn. Now, the way that fire behaves can be illustrated with another triangle that shows how fire line intensity, the energy at the burning front, depends on weather, fuels, and topography. The effects of topography are complex, but the principles follow simple physical rules. For example, fire can spread much faster uphill because heat rises, preheating the fuels upslope, and this can also alter fire effects, the changes it produces to vegetation, soils, and more. Wildfire hazard, behavior, effects, and risk are dynamic because of landscape change. Mount Pisgah offers a window into the past of not just vegetation and biodiversity, but a potential fire behavior. In the foreground, you see an oak savanna that resembles much of the Willamette Valley flora, what they looked like prior to European-American settlement. In the background, you see some of the changes that have occurred, including an extremely dense Douglas fir forest on the nearby butte, conifer forest throughout the lower foothills. You can also see houses in the openings with many more hidden in the forest. These changes exemplify what's occurred throughout much of the U.S. West to contribute to increasing wildfire risk. Primarily due to these 7 factors. The list may not look simple, but let's see how it plays out. Over time, with the loss of indigenous fire, followed by active fire suppression, fuel loads have increased. Simultaneously, the number of homes in wildland fuels has increased. Denser vegetation and fuels mean that once would likely have been a surface fire, creeping along the ground with relatively low risk to homes, may become a surface fire with taller flame lengths and torching of individual trees that creates embers and encounters increasing numbers of homes. Continued forest infill increases the potential for canopy fires, especially when you add in a growing number of ignitions from human sources and more extreme fire weather, all combined putting greater proportions of the increasing number of homes at risk, a complex phenomena, but relatively straightforward when you break it down. So let's look back in time to understand how we got into this predicament. Understanding how we got into our situation in the Willamette Valley is a first step toward building solutions that fit this landscape and can help us address questions of what makes a good landscape for adapting to future wildfire. What should we be doing now to prepare for the next 50 years of climate change and population growth? How do we seam together a path to the future that honors and respects the past while adapting to novel conditions outside the bounds of past experience? I gave a recorded talk last year that built a case for the propositions that oak savanna grasslands have been in the Pacific Northwest for thousands of years and appear well-suited to future climate because of their resilience to, tolerance of heat, drought, and fire. And that the histories of oak savanna grasslands have long been linked to those of indigenous peoples with careful, sophisticated management of grasslands and their economic products, including fire stewardship, through setting fires that produced values, goods, and services while simultaneously managing fire risk. Finally, that we need to prepare the land to receive and transmit fire safely at broad spatial scales with the sophistication and localized place knowledge of the indigenous cultures who inhabited and managed this land for thousands of years. I'm going to give a few visual excerpts here. There are large expanses of native grasslands in the western lowlands of the Pacific Northwest for thousands of years, most of the Willamette Valley floor and foothills. And in the blink of an eye, they were gone. less than 150 years. From that, where those yellows and browns are all grasslands, to this. We're sitting here at the southern end of the Willamette Valley, and specifically in the shed, you can look at the red dot there. Just 175 years ago, we would have been embedded in the midst of an ancient and enormous grassland of prairies and oak savanna. The only forest that was in view of here was along the river. By 1876, looking south from Skinner Butte, you would have seen only grasslands to the horizon, and the only forest in view would have been behind you on the north side of the butte along the river. Early settlers and explorers rhapsodized over the beauty and fecundity of the landscape, which the Kalapuya people called the Valley of the Long Grasses. In fact, the name Kalapuya apparently means Valley of the Long Grasses. The Kalapuya ignited fires on the valley floor and lower foothills for a wide array of purposes that served their highly developed economic system for thousands of years, and as part of this, helped sustain grasslands. Higher up the slopes of the Cascades, the Molalla and the Klamath also used fire, supporting a mosaic of grasslands and forest up into the mountains. In these higher elevations, a second research team I'm part of has been documenting over 5,000 years of indigenous landscape use with extensive travelways connecting the Willamette Valley to the east side of the Cascades. And in the middle, where we think of closed canopy rainforest, we have evidence of a mosaic of grasslands that were managed intensively with fire. We have a 500-year record of fire scars from living and dead trees that shows fires every 3 to 6 years in areas of remnant oak and pine, much faster than we would be expected without human ignitions. We hypothesized this practice wasn't only important for maintaining grassland goods and services in these selected areas, but could have created a mosaic of burns of different ages that altered landscape-scale fire behavior and reduced the likelihood of large, high-severity fires. Beginning around the mid-1800s, the time between fires began to increase until by 1900 they'd ceased completely, well before fire suppression was implemented in the Willamette Valley. Back to the valley floor and foothills, half the savanna and 20% of the prairies have converted to forest or other natural vegetation with higher fuel loadings. 90 to 98% of the savanna and prairie grasslands have been lost. The rarity of these once dominant ecosystems have made them top priority conservation and restoration targets of the Oregon Biodiversity Plan. As grasslands infilled with young trees that grew into dense woodland and then to forest, the amounts and types of fuels and their architecture changed, meaning that vegetation that would likely have burned with a surface fire and perhaps 2 to 20-foot flame lengths became vegetation with the potential to carry an all-consuming canopy fire with flame lengths up to 150 foot high. So where does that process of landscape transformation lead us? Let's look at some current assessments. This hazard map, which was a simplified version of a controversial early attempt to map statewide fire risk, has itself been retracted due to political opposition. It points at specific properties, and people are not happy with that. The good news, though, from it is that compared to much of Oregon, the Willamette Valley floor has lower hazard, in large part because of the mosaic of agricultural lands and roads breaks up fuels. Lower hazard, however, doesn't mean something bad can't happen. On the left is a Lane County risk map. Remember the difference between hazard and risk. Risk is higher further upslope because of greater hazard, but the valley floor still has moderate risk because the higher values at stake, like homes, should a fire occur. Therefore, as we see on right, there are pockets of high potential wildfire impact could occur across most of the valley floor, including around us here. Here's another view that combines hazard and risk. I'm going to give you a number of terms that I hope make some difference for you and will help you track the conversation as we go forward here, but also in your daily lives and later. Areas of orange and yellow are types of wild and urban interface. It's called WUI. If I say WUI, I mean wild and urban interface. It's where housing either mixes with hazardous fuels or is close enough to be threatened by them, thus combining high hazard with high values for high risk. The dark red is medium and high density urban housing. Little hazardous fuels from vegetation, but if structural fires are ignited, they could still burn. Recall that the 2020 Alameda Drive fire burned 4 times as many houses as the Holiday Farm fire in 2% of the area. That's 200 times more losses per unit area because it included urban areas with little structural fire. Finally, this is eWeb's map. It shows specific places to prioritize risk mitigation activities near their infrastructure. They particularly like to work with homeowners, including then view out here, who may have unhealthy trees near power lines so they can reduce the chance that it could fall onto a transmission line during windy conditions and potentially start a fire. But all these maps are based on recent history. What about the future? Especially if the future could be dramatically different than the past. What should we be doing now to prepare for the next 50 years of climate change? I'm going to return to concepts and results from our alternative futures model simulation. A key idea is that of trajectories of landscape change. An example is Eugene's rapid expansion from 1900 to 1980 until Oregon's statewide land use planning policies dramatically curtailed urban sprawl. An unintended and fortuitous consequence of that has been that we have fewer urban and rural homes in the wildland-urban interface, the place of highest risk, than in many other states. But what might happen to wildfire risk if those trends change? This is another view of the study area shown previously. This top, I'm mapping rural tax lots and owner types circa 2010. Outside the urban growth boundary, we see a mix of mostly farmers, foresters, and rural residents. Let's look at what happened as these simulated landowners made decisions about where to build new rural homes under contrasting scenarios of urban and rural development that include a projected doubling of our local population from 2007 to 2057. So, prior to the simulation, all four maps here show the urban growth boundary and different kinds of WUI, wildland-urban interface, as it was in 2010. White areas show places where there are simply too few homes to be classified as WUI. The percentages by each map indicate the proportion of new residents added inside the urban growth boundary versus the percentage outside in rural areas as the population doubles. 5% reflects current state land use planning policy, while the three higher percentages show relaxations of urban growth that resemble those proposed in ballot measures 39 and 48 in the early 2000s. We call the two scenarios on the left compact development and those on the right dispersed development. Let's start the simulation and see how the future trajectories for the WUI differ under these scenarios. Here you can see these scenarios play out. The WUI expands only a little under the compact growth scenarios, but it increases dramatically in dispersed growth scenarios. Let's freeze in 2059. So one of the points I want to make here is that increased wildfire risk around Eugene Springfield doesn't require changes to fuels or to climate. Rural growth, unchecked by our land use policies alone, could do it. Unlike climate change, this is one factor that's very much under our control, and if we lose that control, it could amplify the losses due to climate impacts in wildfire, as illustrated in this maps I showed before. And remember, we only simulated wildfire outside the UGB. That was partly due to technical challenges that we've since tackled, and also based on an expectation that urban resources were high enough to suppress most wildfires, an expectation that's been upended recently. The 2017 Tubbs Fire in California, 100,000 people evacuated and 5,600 structures destroyed, 2,800 in Santa Rosa. The 2021 Marshall Fire in Colorado, 37,000 people evacuated, nearly 1,000 structures lost. And the 2025 Palisades Fire near LA, 150,000 people evacuated, nearly 7,000 structures destroyed. Lives were lost in each of these conflagrations. And in each case, they took a lot of people, perhaps most people, by surprise. So with all this in mind, let's get to the nuts and bolts of how we might create a better landscape for ourselves, our families, and our community by acting preemptively before catastrophe strikes so we can set in motion longer-term plans that reduce risk while supporting other things we care about. I'm going to start by framing the first two concepts of think like wildfire, think about more than wildfire, and then to get to the application at the three scales. Whoops, jumped ahead, sorry. Here we can see homes burned to the ground while adjacent vegetation still stands. We can see a home standing while the vegetation around it was incinerated. Trying to think like wildfire can give you a headache. But even though fire is unpredictable, it obeys the laws of physics, including those related to the factors listed here. And we can change the probabilities when fire rolls the dice. Of these factors, there are things we can control and things we can't. You can't do much about weather, can't do much about topography, but you can do something about ignitions and fuels. Knowing the lawful but unpredictable nature of fire, how can we act? Let's start with these three ideas for thinking like wildfire by considering the ways wildfire can go wrong in our area, what transmits fires, and how to sharpen your eyes to see the landscape in the way that fire does. This shows a typical Pacific Northwest conifer forest. As an ecologist, I describe it as having a ground layer, a shrub layer, and a canopy layer. As a fire person, I'd call these surface fuels, ladder fuels, and canopy fuels. Each different fuel types and different fuels architecture. This single forest structure can carry different types of fire depending on the specifics of the fuel loadings in each of the three layers and the fuel moistures and fire weather on the day of the fire. You can have a surface fire that stays on the ground. You could have a surface fire that leads to torching of individual trees. And in the most extreme cases, independent surface and crown fires moving at different speeds. You just try to stop that. It can't be. If the fire gets large enough, it can even make its own weather, a worst-case scenario for protection suppression efforts. It's important to understand that spotting is greatest from woody fuels. Embers can travel 1 to 2 miles, spreading fire, jumping barriers, and starting new fires. You really want to avoid that in your settlements. So to reduce the likelihood of individual tree torching and canopy fires, we can take actions to reduce the transmission from one layer to the other. Combined actions of thinning the canopy, reducing ladder and surface fuels can limit wildfire intensity and severity and reduce the rate of spread. It's all about probabilities and loading the dice to roll in your favor. So let's look around us and sharpen our eyes. Practice this at home when you're out on a walk. I'm going to start with fuel types and architecture. Fuels can be live or dead, and both can burn. Here you see leaf litter on the ground and green herbaceous fuels that will dry out to burn more easily during the summer. Above them, you see live woody fuels that can carry a fire across the ground or up into the canopy. The totality of the fuel types, their arrangement, and their moistures influence whether and how fire will burn at any given moment and or any given day. Some plants like conifers, including this Pfister juniper up against a house, contain volatile oils and terpenes that can help them burn like torches where they ignite. Much different fire behavior than the hazelnuts and vine maples shown on the left. On the upper right, fuel moistures vary with humidity according to their size. Smaller fuels equilibrate in as little as an hour to the humidity, while larger fuels can take much longer. Fuel moistures and the kind of fire that could occur can change dramatically even in a single day as the humidity changes. Now look at the lower right. The fuel loads on both sides of that path right after mowing are identical. The ones on the left are compressed, a high packing ratio, and once they've dried, a fire could carry, but it would smolder with short flame lengths. The ones on the right are taller, and once they've dried out in the summer the summer drought, they would have abundant oxygen available among them so that once the grasses dry out, they can carry a fast-spreading fire toward the oak woodland uphill. Fortunately, the city mows in Tubman Park, so this isn't likely to happen. But pay your attention to when those dry grasses senesce and create a perfect storm for spreading fire. My friend outside Santa Rosa sent me these pictures with a note that the last wildfire holocaust, they've had multiples, would have burned his home to the ground if a neighbor hadn't knocked over the wooden fence burning toward his home. So fire doesn't see vegetation versus structures. All it sees are fuels, their sizes, their composition, their moistures, and their architecture, and it will use them accordingly to sweep across the landscape. So now let's think about more than wildfire. Wildfire may not happen. Some fuels treatments have little value other than reducing hazard and risk, and may in fact degrade other important values. You could align everything toward mitigating a fire that never came. There are so many choices in vegetation structures that can reduce wildfire risk by modifying fuels, fuel architecture, and fire transmission pathways while supporting wildlife, nature recreation, beauty, and other values. This is as true around your home or in a neighborhood park as it is in the wildlands. So don't just think about reducing hazard, but think about supporting fire-resilient ecosystems. To understand fire, you need to think about fuels, but to understand values, things we care about, you need to think about ecosystems, and I mean that broadly. Every place is an ecosystem. There's potential to create greater fire resilience in any structural type of vegetation, from forest to woodland to savanna, in the wildlands, or around your home. Here's a student example of a fire-resilient woodland that reduces risk through its horizontal and vertical fuel structure. but is specifically managed as wildlife habitat, supporting native plants, insects, birds, mammals, and more. A key concept in wildfire risk management is creating fire-resilient vegetation by restoring fire-adapted ecosystems. And in the lower elevations of the Willamette Valley, oak savanna and prairie grasslands were, and still are, good at supporting low-severity fire to reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfire. For this reason, one of the themes I'll build out throughout this talk is to restore the functions and services of fire-adapted savanna and prairie in selected areas across the landscape, from wildlands to rural residential lands to urban parks to streetscapes and individual yards. The idea is not to recreate the past, but to build on the legacies of the past for a good future. I'm going to go through each scale to think like wildfire and think about more than wildfire. When we look at the potential for wildfire across broad spatial extents, it's clear that hazard, risk, fuels, potential fire behavior change in each of these contexts, from wildlands to rural, suburban, general residential, and urban town centers. And they have to be addressed in relation to one another because fire can spread from one to the other. Note the shift from fire spread via vegetative fuels on the left to structural fuels as housing density increases. So let's start with the parcel scale. It's possible to build structures that will not burn. So maybe Frodo didn't need to run in my little visualization. But to my knowledge, there is no commonly used housing technology that is unburnable. There are houses that are like kindling waiting for a match, and there are houses built exclusively from earth, metal, or concrete that are completely non-combustible, but most people don't live in those kinds of homes. The concepts of using fire-resistant construction in defensible space emerged in the 1980s and have grown and matured since then. There are opportunities to use fire-resistant building materials at the time of construction and when you remodel. One of the simplest things you can do is to create ember-resistant vents under the eaves. It's as simple as 1/8 inch metal mesh coverings to help prevent your house burning from the inside out as embers get into your roof, under your roof. Now, defensible space typically considers 3 zones with increasing actions as you get closer to the house: structural ignition zone, a fire break zone, and a reduced fuel zone. The first thing I would ask you to consider is manage vegetation, but don't freak out. Don't create a war zone. Allow yourself shade, comfort, beauty. This has to be something that lasts, something you can live in, something that provides you the things you need in your life. The most consistent evidence for defensible space making a difference are things immediately around and under the home. Don't store gas or kindling under the porch. Clean the leaves out of your gutters. All the rest that's recommended makes sense and is likely to reduce risk, but how it works and whether it works still depends on the specifics of the fire on the day it occurs. It's all probabilities, and you want to increase your odds of preventing this. You can incorporate many features in your home landscape that improve fire resilience and serve other purposes: pollinator gardens, food gardens. On the lower right, we see a yard and streetscape with remnant oaks from the old savanna creating sparse tree canopy above a lawn. One of the students' ideas that a number of landowners resonated to was the idea of strategically placed planting pods, blocking or revealing views, creating attractive manageable units, but separated by low-hazard vegetation or paths to prevent fire from spreading across the landscape. If you're on a large property, you want to manage vegetation by reducing fuel continuity, making it harder for fire to go up into the canopy from the surface fuels to the ladder fuels to the canopy, or to spread rapidly from one tree crown to another when they're touching. So you want to create gaps between individual trees, and gaps along the ground and between the surface and canopy fuels to make it harder for fire to spread across your property. But keep in mind that in the Willamette Valley, when you open up canopy, things begin to grow in the ground, and you've got to be prepared to manage those fuels. Even the rocks in my backyard have moss all over them. Now, the same principle applies directly around your home. Here's a typical house with foundation shrubs and shading trees that I and all my colleagues were trained to do as landscape architects. But here's that landscape under fire. Ladder fuels allow the fire to spread upward, and continuous combustible vegetation allows fire to spread toward your house. So, you've got to remove the ladder fuels. You need to create gaps. You can do this aesthetically. This is the broad-based standard. How critical it is to implement exactly these dimensions depends on where you are, the type of fire that threatens your home, and how you balance different needs. There are guidelines based on best practices for reducing risk under extreme conditions, and you need to decide how to manage your home and your property. A few weeks ago, I got an assessment from Eugene Springfield Fire so I could show examples of these issues I identified and my thinking about what we'll do around our home. The State Fire Marshal's Office offers free home assessments to residents, both rural and urban. You can probably sign up for one out there. Working with them, Eugene Springfield Fire Department is rolling out a system specifically adapted to urban settings. I toured my yard the day before to anticipate what they'd tell me, but it was still an eye-opener. And I want to emphasize the flexibility of their approach, how they listen to you, and their understanding that we have to balance multiple priorities. The report's delivered online, you get pins on a map, photos, and recommendations. I took my own photos so I could show you how we may implement their recommendations. So, like many of you, we inherited much of our landscaping, in this case from the original 1959 landowners, creating infrastructure we've come to both accept and rely on. One of the first things we can do is replace that last 5 foot of wooden fence that touches the house with unburnable materials. It's not that hard to do. Now, the worst place around the house, though, is this dense bamboo touching the deck connected to the house, but it blocks the view of our neighbors. We really don't want to be looking at them or them looking at us, so what do? We're going to push that bamboo back from the deck a little bit, and we're going to clean out the leaves underneath it so it's less likely to burn up into it, but we have no other solution that we've figured out in the last 20 years for keeping that screening, so that's a risk we're going to accept. Our assessor liked our multiplicity of unburnable paths because they can serve as fuel breaks. Our native prairie plants on the left will senesce in the summer, but with short vegetation, even narrow pathways can stop fire spread. On the right, in our backyard, we're going to expand the path fuel break, remove bridging fuels that could carry across the gap, reduce the height and proximity of shrubs under the eaves. We'll pull the shrubs back from the house, but we're not going to take them out. We value them as wildlife habitat and screening. Instead, we're going to remove the ladder fuels and keep the litter raked away from the house. If I were in eastern Oregon, in Bend, I'd go the full 5 foot with no vegetation. And if summers get worse, we might modify further. In the front yard, we already have fuel breaks from the paths I showed you before out toward the street. We're going to build on that with modest and strategic changes that reduce the likelihood of a fire getting to our house while still maintaining this great bird habitat and beauty that we've hard to create over the last 20 years. And you want to consider your perimeter, how fire could get onto your property. We live up against Tugman Park. It's a wonderful resource, but also puts us near a lot of burnable fuels. The city mows the grasses before fire season, but it's still burnable, and our tinder dry fence is right up against it. Our irrigated food garden on the inside of the fence, however, would be really hard to ignite. Lettuce is difficult to get to burn. And then fire isn't the only danger, right? It's much more likely we'll get blanketed with smoke than that our house is going to burn. Wildfire smoke contains tiny particles that can cause lung damage with acute or long-term exposure. And when houses burn, the toxic load from burning synthetic materials can become extremely dangerous. If you've lived here very long, you know that how stagnant the airflows can get. Wildfire smoke can travel great distances, sink onto the valley floor, and linger for days, sometimes weeks. Lane County has experienced a notable increase in hazardous air quality days during the last decade, almost entirely due to increased wildfire. I'm sure none of you needed to hear that. So we now keep air filters ready to handle smoke beyond what our heat exchanger scrubs out, and they're part of our household summer decor. And for the reasons, and more reasons than just smoke, we've replaced our leaky 1959 aluminum frame windows with ones that seal much better, so I don't have to put tape all over our windows again. Well, let's check to the neighborhood scale next. It incorporates the parcel scale, and both work together. We can have overlapping home ignition zones. What you do can affect your neighbor's risk and vice versa. Here we see overlap in the second zone of vegetation management. Now, as housing gets denser, there's more and more overlap between the 3 ignition zones, including those closest to the houses, with increasing need to work together. Firewise Communities programs supported by local and state agencies provide guidance and support for neighborhoods and small communities who want to work together. Some of you may find that when you're trimming or removing vegetation that's too close to your home, it creates a need for replacement vegetation elsewhere to provide and maintain privacy. And since plants take time to grow, you may want to stage your work to create new visual barriers before removing the current ones. Fire doesn't just attack individual homes or property. Fire flows across the landscape, transmitted by fuels from one place to the next. We live on that red dot there. So you need to consider how it could move toward your home and your neighborhood through one fuel type to another under different wind speeds and directions and different fuel moistures, and you can ask the experts about this. Our property, shown here in red, we have a number of potential canopy fire pathways from the South Hills, although the red road network tends to interrupt potential spread. Those nearby forest patches, though, could be ignition points, not to mention a neighbor's barbecue or my own on a hot summer day. We also need to consider how spotting from embers could advance a fire from as much as 1 to 2 miles away in the South Hills, and what might happen should structures near us begin to burn and become the main mechanism for fire spread. Keep in mind that the inside of most wood frame houses resembles a Boy Scout's well-stacked kindling. So at the neighborhood scale, we need to build trust, relationships, and community. We need to work together. Whether we already know our neighbors or not, it's almost certain that we have a common interest in protecting our families and our neighbors from wildfire, and we need to get to know our neighbors and talk to them. The landscape scale incorporates both the parcel and neighborhood scales and is critical to whether a wildfire ever gets inside Eugene Springfield or not. Think about those catastrophes that happened in Santa Rosa, Colorado, and LA. Fire started outside of town, burned into it. We've recently experienced huge fires approaching from the east under hot, dry, fun winds in September. In California, they call these Santa Ana winds, and studies have shown they're weakening with climate change. But the fire season is moving into the Santa Ana wind season. We could face increased threats from such fires in the future if our fire season gets longer and gets more and more hazardous into October. But what about earlier in the fire season? In July and August, our winds are dominantly from the north. There are fewer hazardous fuels to the north of Eugene, but there's the potential for a fire started in the south of Eugene to burn into rural areas. By September, the winds are shifting to come from the south, and by October, it's the dominant wind direction, increasing the chances that the South Hills could either be the source of an ignition that threatens Eugene, or the first line of defense against such a fire. So I want to consider the South Hills more through the lens of both winds from the north and from the south, starting to return to that simulated wildfire I showed you at the start of this presentation. For 37 years, our model simulated interactions and feedbacks between, on the left, rural and urban development, the center, different kinds of fuel management treatments implemented over time, and on the right, vegetation change due to natural succession, fuels treatments, timber harvest, and wildfire. Let me freeze the landscape to show a hot summer day in 2044 when the winds were blowing hard from the north and a human-caused ignition started a fire just outside the urban growth boundary. In spite of all the treatments in place, weather conditions were so extreme that this simulated fire burned over 30 square miles. The mosaic of fuels treatments created a tortuous path that slowed the fire down and reduced impacts in places treated. Without those treatments, the fire could have been 2 to 5 times larger. But one of the lessons for me was that while we can dramatically reduce impacts, climate change and the conditions on any given day could overwhelm efforts to stop a fire from exploding. There are many things we didn't simulate that protect homes and other values by linking landscape scale to neighborhood scale and site scale actions. But let's stick with the landscape scale for right now and think about actions in the South Hills as a potential which serves as a potential fire transmission pathway, whether away from or into Eugene. South Hills public lands are an incredible resource for us, linking biodiversity conservation, nature experience, and wildness on the edge of town, with many kinds of recreational activities. But they can also reduce wildfire risk or augment it, depending on how they're managed. To their credit, the city's been reducing surface and ladder fuels and tree density and restoring oak and prairie grasslands in the South Hills and other areas. A staff member told me that prior to the holiday farm fire, one of the challenges they faced was people who didn't want to see any trees or shrubs removed. Now, she says, some people are so worried about wildfire, they want all the combustible vegetation removed. either extreme is counterproductive, and we don't need to throw out all the other good things that our public lands provide us. And you can't stop vegetation from growing in the southern Willamette Valley. Instead, we need to remember that there are many interlocking pieces to the puzzle of reducing potential losses from wildfire that may never come, while supporting other values that we benefit from every day. So let's think about what's already being done and how we could continue to build on these actions of both public and private lands to provide a more connected, protected band of fire-resilient landscape around Eugene. For example, we can make strategically located small areas do big work while not losing sight of multiple values, thinking like wildfire while thinking about more than wildfire. There are many types of fuel breaks that interrupt fire flow and drop a canopy fire to the ground where it's easier to suppress. One of the challenges is that fire doesn't care if something is public or private land. We need to find ways to link public-private efforts to make them work most effectively. I think about the slides Ariel was showing us at the beginning of this presentation about the acquisitions, this creation of a continuous band of trails and properties throughout the South Hills. We need to think carefully about what will make good climate and fire-resilient vegetation over the next 50 to 100 years. If you look around the South Hills, you're going to see areas of Douglas fir die-off. It's not as extreme as in southern Oregon, where they call it Firmageddon, or other parts of the West, but particularly has happened in areas where Doug fir has established on drier, stressful locations, usually encroaching on remnant oak habitat. Even when healthy, Douglas fir burn differently than oaks. They have terpenes and oils in the foliage and the wood. There's less moisture in their needles than do broadleaf oaks, so they burn at a higher intensity and they torch more easily. Oaks are well suited to future climate, less likely to support a crown fire. So oak restoration offers an opportunity to turn a problem of increasing Doug fir die-off and its potential in the future into a solution. At the same time, our simulation modeling suggested that grassland restoration can be a two-edged sword in our summer drought. When tall, dry grasses ignite, fire can spread quickly. Even if a grassland fire has relatively short flame lengths and offers control points for suppression, if left unchecked, it can transmit fire toward homes or other untreated forest. One has to manage grasslands effectively and efficiently over time, for example, with prescribed fire or mowing. But again, if you're going to roll the dice, which would you rather have? At even larger spatial scales, the Willamette Valley Oak Prairie Cooperative has created a vision for oak and prairie grassland restoration that aims to link biodiversity, conservation with recreation and wildfire risk mitigation. You can see some of those materials outside. Note that the red areas around Eugene show currently conserved lands, and the large yellow area is a priority area for public and private partnerships. It's a large vision that will take long-term commitment, including financing, and they're currently developing a business plan to try and give it legs, and they need our support. This is a spatial plan of vegetation types, but how do we manage natural vegetation over time at large spatial scales for fire resilience? Remember that quote about it's not a matter of if something will burn in the West, but when? I want to switch the question from mitigating wildfire risk to living with fire. Shakespeare said, "Be fire with fire." That got reframed as fighting fire with fire, which literally is used in wildfire suppression efforts, but I really prefer the Bard's version of being with fire. Fire performs good work. It's a key ecological process for restoring, renewing, and even stabilizing ecosystems. The problem is that by relying on fire suppression, we shifted fire regimes from low and mixed severity fires toward high severity, stand replacing, and often canopy fires. What kind of future do we want? One where we rely increasingly on impossible attempts to suppress all fire, or one in which we allow fire to do its work under managed conditions, bringing back good fire into the landscape? In fact, using prescribed fire to reduce fuel loads can work hand in hand with the need to suppress wildfires around homes and property, making a Sisyphean task merely Herculean. The choice in part is, do you want to burn like this or like this? The City of Eugene and Allied Rivers to Ridges partners have been working to implement more and more prescribed fire. This is just their plan for 2025, but they need our support. Smoke from prescribed fire can be an inconvenience on a given day, but it can reduce the risk of out-of-control wildfires with their extreme and much more hazardous smoke. The impetus and capacity for much more prescribed fire is growing across the U.S. West, from state and federal agencies burning on public lands, to collaborative public-private efforts, to community-based networks working with homeowners, and a resurgence of indigenous fire stewardship. We need to get lots of prescribed fire on the ground to reduce wildfire risk economically while allowing fire to do the good work that it does for ecosystems. This won't happen without overcoming many obstacles, and perhaps it seems too idealistic and ambitious. And yet, when we ask an advisory committee of hardcore, no-nonsense fire risk specialists in Central Oregon what their vision of a fire-resilient landscape was, they imagined being able to sit on their back porches, drinking a beer, and watching a wildfire creep by without endangering them. And lots of prescribed fire was an essential ingredient of getting there. One of the keys to increasing risk mitigation treatments, and especially prescribed fire, is something both simple and elusive: trust. Trust between government agencies and residents. Trust among representatives of different organizations. Trust between neighbors. Greater trust builds strong and reinforcing bonds between members of the fire management network, which includes all of us. We're just wrapping up simulation modeling in Central Oregon to explore and test how trust and private-public collaboration could affect wildfire losses in the future. We've simulated nearly 1,000 alternative futures from 2020 to 2059, and the range of outcomes is enormous. But in this example, the exact same fire ignites in the exact same location under the same extreme fire weather conditions, but encounters a different landscape. In the upper panel, greater investment in outreach and engagement by the fire management network and greater overall social cohesion among residents build enough trust and social capital to perform extensive thinning and prescribed fire treatments near the WUI on both public and private lands around Bend, Oregon. As a result, the fire destroyed 20 dwelling units. It approached Bend, but stopped just outside the UGB. In the lower panel, there was little outreach and engagement, less social cohesion among residents, making it easier for a small amount of opposition to prevent prescribed fire near the WUI. As a result, there was little prescribed fire on private lands, and federal prescribed fire was pushed away from the WUI to avoid opposition. As a consequence, that same fire burned through the WUI and into Bend itself, destroying 7,500 dwelling units, 6,500 of them inside the UGB. Let's remember that things we don't expect could happen here. So in summary, to learn to live with more fire under a changing climate, we need to act at 3 scales. Understanding that different kinds of opportunities and needs drive different kinds of actions at each scale, while critically, planning and coordination must occur across all 3, including responsibilities that come down to each of us as residents or landowners. We need to think like wildfire while thinking about more than wildfire to protect the values, the things we care about in our landscapes that we live with every day. We need to create fire-resilient landscapes that serve multiple purposes, support multiple values, while producing reliable benefits, including, I would argue, restoring Willamette Valley oak and prairie grasslands. Many of the actions needed at each scale take time to implement and mature. We need to act now to preempt future wildfire, not just for next year's possible surprises, but over a 50 to 100-year horizon of trying to anticipate surprise and putting things in motion, many of which take a long time to mature, so we can achieve that vision of a landscape that we want our children to live in. We need collaboration and coordination built with firm roots in our own treasured landscape. We need to help the people and organizations and our local fire management network achieve this vision across all 3 spatial scales and do our part on our own properties and neighborhoods. Think less about them, more about us. We need to build trust, relationships, community with our neighbors through civic organizations, within and among the organizations and agencies who work to protect us from being taken by surprise by wildfires. I'd like to call this expanded network our community fire net. Importantly, federal agencies have been key players in local and regional efforts. BLM, Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife, Army Corps, not only on their lands, but by supporting initiatives on other ownerships with funding and logistical assistance. It's not clear how much their support might change in the short term, but the writing's been on the wall for quite some time. With increasing risk across the entire nation, we need to do more ourselves. This means more local initiatives and participation, more local and regional funding, which also means greater local and regional self-reliance and control of our future. In a moment, I'll introduce the organizations here with us tonight, and we'll have a Q&A period, but that's the end of the talk, so thank you.